I start off talking about my parents because they had such an influence on the direction that my life took. They were Baptists, Southern Baptists. So I was brought up in the Baptist faith tradition. They were leaders in the church. My dad served as a deacon, and both of my parents taught adult Sunday school classes. And it seemed like we were at the church every time the doors opened. And I learned to take my religion very seriously. So much so that when it was time to choose a college to attend, I chose Baylor University. And it was at Baylor that I had to face the fact that I was different because I fell in love with a girl at Baylor. Now, when I had been in high school, I had what I called strange feelings toward a particular girl. Having been brought up in a very, very conservative home, I had never heard the words gay, lesbian, homosexual. I had no idea it was even possible for a girl to fall in love with another girl. So I had no vocabulary to explain to myself who it was and what it was that I was feeling. So as I've already mentioned, I fell in love at Baylor. We were both 17, and this was in 1956. When the Christmas holidays came, we were separated for the first time, and we missed each other so much that we were always writing letters back and forth. Each evening I propped up in bed and I wrote to her. My dad was a sociology major with knowledge of same-sex attractions and rightly concluded that his only daughter was gay. He shared this information with my mother and suggested she go in and have a talk with me. So she came into my bedroom that evening and she shared with me what she had been taught about being gay, that it was sinful and certainly an unacceptable way for me to live my life. Now, she and Dad had plans for me to earn my teaching certificate. And she told me that evening that no school district would hire me to teach in their schools. She also explained we would have a very difficult time just finding a place to live, that no one would rent us an apartment, and few people would even sell us a house. So she painted a very bleak picture of our future together. Her talk with me that evening devastated me. I felt guilty, I felt shameful for something that I felt I couldn't help. After all, I hadn't planned to fall in love with a girl. I would have much preferred to have fallen in love with a boy, someone I could proudly show off, someone I could marry, someone with whom I could have a family, but that didn't happen to me. I fell in love with a girl, and I felt my life was in a mess. I felt sorry for myself. And what I yearned for that evening was for my mother to show a little bit of sympathy for the predicament I was in. But all I received was condemnation and a type of cease and desist message. This was the beginning of a life pretending to be something I really wasn't. I had always dated. I dated throughout high school. I continued to date in college. It was part of the front, part of the fitting in that became a part of my life. When I was 23, I was teaching high school in Odessa, which is out in West Texas. And one day I simply said to myself, LouAnne, you're not going to ever fall in love with a man. Quit waiting for that to happen. But you do need to get married. So just pick out a nice fella, marry him, and get it over with. It wasn't long after I made that decision to marry without love that a friend arranged a blind date for me. He was a nice fella, a school teacher with aspirations to be a school administrator. And this appealed to me because my dad was a school administrator. His dad was a Southern Baptist preacher. He loved children. He very much wanted to have a family. And I wanted to have children. So I asked myself, what more is it that I'm looking for? He fits the bill. We were married in March of 1963. It wasn't long after we married when I realized I had made a terrible mistake. I was very unhappy. But by the time I began to seriously consider divorce, we had had our first child, a little boy named after his dad. And as I contemplated asking for a divorce, I told myself it would be cruel to separate this father from his young son. And then I told myself that I would bring shame to my parents, who were in the public eye in Little Rock, because getting a divorce in the 60s was shameful. And then I told myself I would bring pain to my in-laws who loved me and were proud of me, and I would be divorcing their eldest son. So as I thought through all these ramifications of getting a divorce, I always came to the same conclusion, that no one would benefit from a divorce but me. And that made it a very selfish decision. I had been taught all my life not to be selfish. So I eventually decided that I would honor my wedding vows till death do you part. And that's what I did for 37 years. But I was very unhappy during that time. We have 4 children, and they brought light and joy into my life, and they still do. But I was determined that no one would ever know that I was gay. I especially didn't want my husband to ever find out that I was gay. I also avoided reading anything about homosexuality for fear someone would see me reading that kind of literature or material and figure out that I was gay. So I went through life very ignorant of the subject. I actually thought I was a unique human being, suffering in a way no one else was suffering. I also avoided having a close friend for fear I might fall in love with her. After all, that's what had happened to me at Baylor. So I became a shell of a person. I wasn't the woman I was created to be. I began to think of my inability to love a man as that dirty trick God played on me. Over and over that thought would go through my mind. And then I added to the thought by saying, but God's trying to make up for that dirty trick he played on me by giving me a good life. Because I had a good life. I had married a good man. I had 4 wonderful children. I had a secure life. But I was always thinking of my college love, missing her, wondering where she was, what she was doing, whether or not she was happy. And when I'd think about her, the tears would come. And I convinced myself that I would never again be happy here on earth, that only by dying and going to heaven would I ever again be happy. So I spent close to 40 years of my life yearning for death, thinking of all kinds of ways I could kill myself, and eventually just begging God to take me, and to take me right then, that I was ready to go. But all of this changed in August of 1999. At that time, I was teaching a ladies' Sunday school class in the First Baptist Church here in downtown Tyler. It was a small class. I hadn't been teaching it long, and I didn't know the members well at all. And one morning, I was simply visiting with one of those members. We were sharing with each other information about our families and our faith. And she began telling me about her son, who was an artist, and she told me that he was such a kind and thoughtful person, especially to his grandmother. And it was about then this thought came into my mind, like a light bulb going off. Her son is gay. Now, the thought I had was not in the form of a question like, I wonder if her son is gay. It wasn't like that. I knew her son was gay. And for that reason, I believe God put that thought in my head. And I believe God pushed me into what I did next, which was totally illogical. Because I asked this woman, is your son a homosexual? Well, you don't ask people that question, especially in the conservative area like Tyler, Texas, and a member of a Southern Baptist church. She was shocked. And she hesitated quite some time before she eventually said, yes, but that's just the way God made him, and God loves him just the way he is. Well, it was my turn to be shocked. I had never heard that before, that God loved gays, and especially that God loved gays when they weren't even pretending to be straight. Her words that morning changed my life. It would take too long to explain all the emotions I experienced that very afternoon. But my final emotion centered in on this woman. Her words of acceptance, words I'd never heard before, stirred that dead spot in my heart, and I fell in love with her. After all my efforts to avoid this very problem, never telling anybody I was gay, never reading about the subject, never having a close friend, all of those efforts had been for naught, because that feeling of love for a woman came completely out of the blue and hit me hard. I couldn't pretend any longer. I had to get out of my marriage. And about 5 months later, I asked my husband for a divorce, simply telling him I was very unhappy in the marriage. And I moved out of our home into a small one-bedroom apartment. About 2 months later, he sent me a long email asking me to please be specific about what there had been in the marriage that had made me so unhappy. I didn't want to answer that letter because I had never had any intention of ever admitting to anyone that I was gay. But when I reread his letter, I realized he was blaming himself for some things that had nothing to do with my asking for a divorce. And then I reminded myself we'd been married for 37 years, and I felt I owed him the truth. So late that evening, I wrote a long email back. I simply told him that I was gay, that I'd always been gay. And then I tried to explain what it's like to be gay in a world that doesn't accept gays. He wrote back immediately saying that this was a subject he didn't want to discuss on the web, but asked if he could come by my apartment the next morning after his exercise class, and I said certainly. So when I opened the door to him about 9 o'clock the next morning, he took me in his arms and held me tight and began sobbing. And I held him and cried. And when we eventually sat down on the sofa, I placed a box of tissues between us. And I gave him an opportunity to vent for all those years of frustration when he had tried to be close to me and just couldn't. He'd always said there was a wall between us. And I'd always known he was right, but I never told him he was. One of the questions he asked me that morning was, "Is this something you thought about every year?" And I said, "Every year, I thought about it every day." And he said, "It must have been a miserable life." When I came out to my brother in California, he told me I needed a support group because I didn't know any other gays. None. And he sent me a list of various organizations, which I looked up on the web, found a lot of them were in Dallas, but that's a good hour and a half away. One of them was in Tyler, Texas, and that was PFLAG, East Texas PFLAG. Now, PFLAG at that time stood for Parents, Families, and Friends of Lesbians and Gays. I'd never heard of it. But I called their phone number, found out when and where their next meeting would take place, and on Monday evening, April the 10th of 2000, I drove to St. Francis Episcopal Church, parked my car, and just sat in it for a while, working up the courage to walk into a meeting of strangers and out myself to them. At that time, I was 61, and I had spent my whole life hiding the fact that I was gay. And I knew that my life would be changing after that evening. When I sat in my car that evening, I'll have to admit that there was a certain curiosity on my part as to what gays and lesbians looked like and acted like, because I was just as much a victim of misinformation as everybody else. When I eventually walked into that room of 25 to 30 people, there was one empty chair by the woman who is now my wife, Brenda McWilliams. We were in a relationship for over 17 years now. The last 2 is legally married, and I've always felt God was really watching over me that evening. In fact, that first PFLAG meeting seemed very much like a church service to me because there was a lot of talk about God and how much God loves gays despite the messages we were getting from pulpits around town. When I actually came out in my church, I started feeling very uncomfortable. There were several members I considered friends who simply could not look me in the eye. And it made me feel as if they saw me as the epitome of evil itself that they couldn't look upon. And I gave serious consideration to leaving the church, finding somewhere else to worship where I would feel more comfortable. But I feel God nudged me and reminded me that at that time I had been a member of First Baptist for almost 12 years. And the congregation knew me not only as a Christian, but as the wife of a deacon, the mother of 4 children, a Sunday school teacher, handbell ringer, and a very active and supportive member of the congregation. And if I left, then I would be throwing away all that goodwill, so to speak. Whereas if I stayed, I told myself I had a very unique opportunity to become known as a gay Christian. What to many, if not most, and maybe all the members was an oxymoron. So I decided I would stay. And then when Brenda joined me there, shortly thereafter, then we became the church's example of a gay Christian couple, and we made a point of sitting together about the 3rd row from the front in the center section where everybody could see us. And we remained as active as they would allow us to be, and there were restrictions placed upon us. And we remained an additional 14 years. We finally left in the first part of 2015. I spent most of my life believing that being gay was some kind of moral failing. And I did everything in my power to hide the fact that I was gay. But now, I believe that being gay is just the way some people are. It's the way I am. And I'm thankful for God's love and for the freedom He gives me to simply be who I am. Well, my purpose for writing the story, at least at the beginning, was to have a target audience of fundamentalist Christians who were convinced that being gay was chosen. And I have always felt that my story depicts perfectly that being gay is not chosen. And I wanted to target that group and convince them of the erroneous belief that we can change, that gays can change and become straight people. You know, all they have to do is pray. Goodness knows I prayed. For years I prayed, and I knew that was not the solution. It did not change me. So that was my target audience. And then once I realized that fundamentalist Christians are not interested in my story, then I thought, well, I had learned by that time that those who were interested were those who had lived either a life similar to mine or who had gay children. And this targeted the PFLAG organization. And so many of the talks that I have given through 9 different states at this time have been to PFLAG groups primarily. Although there have been a few churches, there have been some college classes, but primarily the PFLAG groups. It's amazing how many will come up to me afterwards and say, "You just told my story." Or some statement I made, they say, "That's exactly how I felt." So I have become a voice for many who have the same story to share and just have not been able to share it in the way I have. So I never started off to be a gay advocate. That was not my goal. My goal was to convince fundamentalist Christians. And then I realized in the attempt to do that, I have become a gay activist and have become able to admit that I'm gay. It no longer bothers me. I'm proud of the fact that I'm gay. I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world.